welcome back to another review video. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 11. We're going to start with talking about testing and individual differences. We're going to begin with intelligence. So intelligence is the ability to solve problems and the ability to adapt. Now, psychologists Spearman, Gardner, and Sternberg have different theories about intelligences. So Spearman had the theory of one general intelligence, or otherwise known as the general G, and he was supported by psychologist L.L. Thurstone. Next, we have psychologist Gardner, who proposed the idea that there are 8 separate intelligences that are independent of one another, and savant syndrome can happen if you are very strong in one of those 8, but maybe not so strong in the others. And then finally, we have psychologist Sternberg, who proposed 3 intelligences, or the triarchic theory, which basically says intelligence is broken down into analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. Next, we're going to talk about intelligence tests. Now, intelligence tests are like aptitude tests, for example, the SAT. Now, there are different leaders in the field of intelligence testing. First, we have Francis Galton, who is a cousin of Charles Darwin and believer that intelligence traits were passed down through genes. Then we have Alfred Binet, who created a concept of mental age, meaning that you could be, whatever age you are, but your mental age could be different. Then we have Louis Terman, who basically adapted Binet's test to Californian children and renamed the test to the Stanford Binet test. Then we have William Stern. Now, William Stern is pretty important because he creates the famous IQ test. Now, it should be noted that the IQ test is pretty flawed, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But finally, we have David Wechsler, who created the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales, one of the most widely used tests for intelligence. So definitely William Stern and David Wechsler, you should know, because they created pretty famous tests. Now, when you're thinking about an intelligence test, there are 3 components that need to be there. The test has to be uniform, meaning it has to, apply the same way to every person. It has to be reliable. So that means if I take the test more than once, I'm going to get around the same score. And finally, it should have validity. It should have content validity, which means the test is, pertaining strictly to the topic being tested, right? So if I'm trying to, test my psychology skills, I'm not getting like an AP calculus test, for example. It should also show predictability, validity, which basically means the test is able to predict future performance. Now, there are 2 kinds of intelligences that we have to talk about here. We have crystallized and we have fluid. So crystallized reflects the knowledge we've accumulated like over time, and fluid is how we reason and how quickly and abstractly we can start to think. And this starts to decrease in our 20s and 30s. And finally, we're going to talk about bias. Now, some form of bias includes gender bias. For example, men think that they are super smart. Women are less likely to, overestimate their intelligence, but both males and females score about the same. There are also environmental factors, right? Depending on what resources you had access to, you might have different amounts of knowledge and intelligence. And then we have the 2 kinds of bias. We have classical bias, which is in the test. So classical bias would be the test is written in a way that is unfair towards a certain group of people. Or you have innate bias. Now, classical bias doesn't actually appear that much in intelligence tests, but innate bias does. Oh my god, I'm getting tongue twisted. Innate bias does. So innate bias is basically between the writer and the taker. If the test writer has had different experiences than the test taker, there's going to be a bias that you just can't get rid of because they're different people. They've had different experiences. And now, Clark is going to move on to Unit 12.
Thanks, Will. Let's get right into Unit 12, which is about abnormal behavior. We're going to begin by defining what psychological disorders even are, because this unit focuses on them pretty much exclusively. They're a collection of symptoms that disrupt an individual's normal way of thinking, feeling, their mood, behavior, or the way they interact with others, and is accompanied by significant distress or dysfunction. A key term you'll have to know when describing these disorders is what's called maladaptive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. That just mean they interfere with day-to-day life and they make the day-to-day life much more difficult for the individual. The causes of psychological disorders are equally complex and vary depending on the particular disorder and the individual. But psychiatrists do have a few tools that help them understand disorders. One approach that psychologists use to understand where a disorder came from is called the biopsychosocial approach. And while I know this term may be kind of a mouthful, it just means that our biology, psychology, and the social cultural factors in our lives interact together to create disorders, and they don't just come out of the blue. Another important concept is called the medical model, which is the idea that psychological disorders should be treated as physical diseases, and they use medication as treatment. Basically, the medical model treats disorders the same way as it would a broken bone. When you hear this term, think medical medicine. Our next term is the DSM-5, which is basically just a big book that helps psychiatrists assess and diagnose mental disorders by listing common symptoms that provide clues to what disorder a person may have. However, the DSM-5 describes ADHD symptoms super vaguely, which is a big problem, because this increased awareness, coupled with a few pretty common symptoms, is resulting in kids who are just simply energetic being misdiagnosed with a disease that they don't even have. But let's talk about some other psychological disorders. We're going to give you the basic definition and some key characteristics of them. But if you need a little bit more information about any of these, make sure to check out our videos on Unit 12, which go into much more depth. We're going to begin with anxiety disorders, which are consistent feelings of anxiety and stress that's way out of proportion to the actual impact of the event. And some examples of these are generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and your classic phobias. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, is just characterized by unreasonable thoughts and fears or obsessions that lead to compulsive behaviors. Finally, it's the last one. Oh, perfect. But next, let's talk about PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is characterized by after facing a trauma, you continue to experience haunting nightmares, anxiety, and/or insomnia caused by the trauma. This is especially potent from people who experience war or other traumatic events. But let's also talk about major depressive disorder, which is a state of hopelessness and lethargy that lasts for several weeks or even months and can lead to suicidal thoughts and a loss of interest in everyday activities. Persistent depressive disorder is similar. However, the big distinction is that the symptoms are milder and they last for much longer periods of time. Bipolar disorder is next, and it's the alternation between the hopelessness and lethargy of depression and the overexcited, hyperactive state of mania. It's essentially where you're riding on a roller coaster of incredibly destructive emotions. And next, we have schizophrenia, which is a breakdown in the relationship between thought, emotion, and behavior that leads to someone's faulty perception of reality, withdrawal from it, and personal relationships into fantasy and delusion. And it often results in the hearing of voices that don't actually exist. And some quick ones that we'll cover briefly are somatic symptom disorder first, which presents a bodily symptom or somatic symptom which can't be medically explained, even though it's a genuinely felt illness. One example of these is the illness anxiety disorder, where you're convinced you have an illness that you simply do not. Another name for this is called hypochondriac, which my mom, unfortunately, loves to use for me. But next, we have dissociative disorders, which are rare disorders in which a person's conscious awareness separates from painful memories and results in their brain altering their reality. The most famous of these is dissociative identity or multiple personality disorder, which is seen a lot in Hollywood. Dude, I have the worst headache.
Have you Googled your symptoms?
Yeah, it's either a brain tumor, cancer, lymphoma, or the coronavirus. And I know it's a really small chance, but there is a chance that I'm just dehydrated. Personality disorders are disruptive, inflexible, and enduring patterns of behavior that impair people's social interactions. Socio and psychopaths are both individuals with personality disorders called antisocial personality disorders. And finally, we have eating disorders, which are 3. We start with anorexia nervosa, in which a person starves themselves despite being significantly underweight. Bulimia, when a person will enter a binge eating, then purge, which you can puke up the food that you just ate, and then depression cycle. And then we have binge eating disorder, which is where you eat way too much and then enter a state of remorse. So you can kind of see this as a spectrum, eating almost nothing to eating almost way too much. Take it away, Will.
I'd be glad to. So let's get into treatment of abnormal behavior. Now, as we learned at Unit 12, there are a lot of different psychological disorders that people have. In the past, people treated these disorders by drilling holes into their heads, tying them up, or performing exorcisms. Today, we do things a little bit differently. We give patients welcoming environments to recover in, talk to them about childhood experiences, current feelings, and maladaptive thoughts and behaviors. We've learned to prescribe certain drugs to help patients grow and recover from their disorders. So let's talk about the different types of therapies that we use today and how we treat abnormal behavior. This chapter is a very term-dense chapter, so as long as you have a solid understanding of these terms, you'll be just fine for the exam. So first, we have psychotherapy. Now remember, modern Western therapies are classified into 2 main categories, and we start with, of course, psychotherapy, which is treatment involving psychological techniques. This consists of interactions between a trained therapist and someone seeking to overcome psychological difficulties or achieve personal growth. The second modern Western therapy is biomedical therapy. This offers medication and other biological treatments that act directly on the person's physiology. Now, we're going to talk about eclectic approaches. Now, this is basically like practicing psychotherapy, but this is also using a biomedical therapy at the same time by prescribing medication. Now, you're also going to have to understand psychoanalytic theory, which has been covered in previous chapters, such as Unit 10, when we talked about personality, which was the first major psychological therapy that included things like free association and the analysis of the unconscious. It was Freud's major theory, but it isn't really considered credible today since it has branched off into psychodynamic theories. Next, we have humanistic therapies, which are also called insight therapies, which aim to boost people's self-fulfillment by helping them grow in self-awareness and self-acceptance. Right? We've all heard this before. It's Carl Rogers all over again. We can remember that he developed a therapy called a client-centered therapy, which acts on the principle of the client leading the discussion, and for the therapist to actively listen with an accepting, genuine, and empathetic environment, or AGE, to help you remember the 3. Next, we have behavior therapy, which basically is the idea that our problems result from problematic behavior. And if we unlearn this behavior and replace it with the positive and more advantageous ones, then we can overcome our challenges. Behavioral therapists champion the idea that because you know you're scared of horse girls doesn't mean they're less scary. But by using such tools as counter conditioning, exposure therapies, systematic desensitization, aversive conditioning, or even virtual reality exposure therapy, we can learn more adaptive behavior, like steering clear of them in the hallway or just ignoring them, so that you end up not being so afraid of them anymore. Now we have cognitive therapy, which teaches people new, more adaptive ways of thinking, which is based on the assumption that our thoughts stand in between events and our reactions to them. Now, a subpart of this is REBT, which teaches people to think like middle school posters, rational emotive behavior therapy, thinking about, having a growth mindset. And finally, we're going to talk about group and family theories, which are exactly what they sound like, right? You get together with a group, and this group interaction is going to serve as a way to view people in the context of their family situation and help multiple people see the impact that they have on one another. Now, there are 6 modern psychotherapies that you should know for the exam. They're listed on the blue chart on the right of the screen, so make sure to understand those. If you want more detail on them, we have covered them in past videos. But we're also going to talk about biomedical therapies that change the brain's chemistry with prescription drugs, affect its circuitry with electrical stimulation, magnetic pulses, or psychosurgery, or influence its responses with lifestyle changes. Now, part of this is antipsychotic drugs, which help treat schizophrenia and other thought disorders by reducing their hallucinations and paranoia. We also have anti-anxiety drugs that are used to control anxiety and agitation, and antidepressant drugs that do just that, treat depression, anxiety orders, and OCD. However, psychiatrists can also, quote unquote, shock their patients with electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, which stimulates the brain of a severely depressed patient who hasn't been responding to drug therapy. The shock administers a 30-second to minute-long seizure in the patient, but it's not felt or remembered upon awakening from the anesthetic. Now, there are three very other similar therapies called transcranial electrical stimulation, magnetic stimulation, and deep brain stimulation. Now that we understand all that, Clark is going to finish us off with Unit 14, Social Psychology.
All right, on to our last unit of social psychology. Let's begin by understanding what social psychology even is. It's a scientific study of how we as individuals think about, influence, and relate to one another, how we interact as a society. Attribution theory is the theory that we explain someone's behavior by crediting either the situation or the person's usual way of doing things, and it's important that you'll know for the test. An example of this is deciding that just because Debbie doesn't like talking in math class, she must be a shy person in general, right? Not exactly. People act differently around everyone, and depending on the situation, Debbie's friends may tell you that she's the most talkative and outgoing person that they know. This tendency to ignore the fact that people act differently depending on the situation and overestimate the impact of the person's average behavior around you is called the fundamental attribution error. But moving on to attitudes, let's understand that there are feelings, often influenced by our beliefs, that predispose our reactions to objects, people, and events. There are two forms of persuasion that you'll need to know, which are tactics used to influence people's attitudes and change them on certain issues. Peripheral route persuasion is when people are influenced by attention-grabbing statements, celebrities, and evoke an emotional response. Central route persuasion is when people are influenced more by evidence, statistics, and those good hard facts, and they prioritize a logical argument, for example. If you've ever had to endure an English unit on rhetoric, then you know about ethos, pathos, and logos. And a super easy way to distinguish these two persuasion tactics is to remember that peripheral persuasion appeals to the emotions. Think pathos, PP. And central appeals to logic. Think logos. Our actions also affect our attitudes. The foot and door phenomenon is the tendency for people who have first agreed to a small request by someone to comply later with a larger one that may actually contradict their normal attitude on the subject. And one key idea to understand is that the situation we're in can be super influential in how our attitudes change. Sometimes our attitude doesn't even line up with our actions. We may feel one way, but for some reason act in a completely different way. This disconnect is called cognitive dissonance theory, and our mind can deal with this disconnect by changing our attitudes entirely just to fit our new actions. Moving on to conformity and obedience, it's important to understand that when talking about social influence, we remember that social norms greatly influence people's behavior. Norms are understood rules for accepted and expected behavior in society. As a kid, having TikTok is the norm, which I do spend way too much time on, but when you're an adult, you most likely have Facebook, which to us is basically prehistoric at this point. But the idea is that there's a social norm for kids to have TikTok and a social norm for adults to have Facebook. Our social influences, mostly our peers, also greatly impact us, and we can see this through the ideas of conformity and normative social influence, which are both really similar ideas and result from our desire to conform or be more like the people around us. Another example of social influence is called informational social influence, and it's a little bit different, but it just means that we accept other people's words as facts, even though it may not be the reality. Also, obedience is a term you'll have to know for the exam, and it's when a person obeys instructions or orders from an authority figure. Pretty simple. But before we move on, it's important to understand that 3 of the most famous research projects in psychology were all done by social psychologists, and you need to have a good understanding of all 3 for the test. Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment revealed how social roles, such as being a prisoner or a security guard can influence our behavior. And Ash's conformity experiment measured the extent to which social pressure from a majority could affect a person to conform when deciding which line is the same length as the line on the left. Milgram's obedience experiment investigated one's obedience to authority and had someone shock a peer just because someone told them to. Group behavior is something that you have to know for the test, but we're going to be going a little bit quicker through some of these terms. So when you see them, make sure you have a good understanding of what they mean and where they show up in the real world. Social facilitation is when your performance improves on simple or well-learned tasks in the presence of others. Social loafing is the tendency of people in a group to exert less effort when combining their efforts toward attaining a common goal, which is just hubbubaloo for when that one kid does absolutely no work in the group project. De-individuation is our reduced self-awareness in large settings or groups that makes us choose bad decisions, basically, and lowers our self-restraint when we're in large crowds or riots, for example. Group polarization describes the fact that when we hear other people share our opinion on something, we become more convinced of our opinion's accuracy. One of the most polarizing inventions of our generation is the internet. Apps like YouTube and Instagram recommend content for us that is similar to our own interests. And when we see that other people have the same ideas or beliefs as we do, we begin to feel more confident in our own opinion. Big Daddy 123. Do you also think that pigeons should be trained to carry out aerial assaults?
Pigeon Lover 420. I totally agree.
Awesome! We'll start our campaign group today. For example, numerous studies have shown that because the internet allows people to interact with those who agree with them, white supremacists feel validated in their opinions and are becoming even more racist. And despite the fact that furry communities are growing in number, we also see that peacemakers grow stronger in their convictions and that people who are fighting for the rights of others are more confident to make positive change. The internet did all of that, both good and bad. This is a good segue to prejudice and discrimination, and these are the key terms you'll have to know. Prejudice is an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude toward a group and its members. Prejudice generally involves stereotyped beliefs, negative feelings, and a predisposition to discriminatory action. A stereotype is a generalized, sometimes accurate, but often overgeneralized belief about a group of people, and discrimination is an unjustifiable, negative behavior toward a group and its members. The just world phenomenon is the tendency for people to believe the world is just and that people therefore get what they deserve and deserve what they get. Unfortunately, an example of this is when people somehow justify rape by saying that the victim had it coming for them. In-group bias is the tendency to favor our own group in a situation. Scapegoat theory is a theory that prejudice offers an outlet for anger by providing someone to blame. A prime example of this is how the Nazis blamed the Jewish community for the country's economic failures. As we know, the Jewish people did absolutely nothing wrong, but by pointing the finger at someone, the German people could have a group to blame. The other race effect is the tendency to recall one's own race more accurately than the faces of other races. But let's also talk about aggression and attraction. Aggression is defined as any physical or verbal behavior intended to harm someone, physically or emotionally, and it's influenced by our biopsychosocial factors. Our biology influences aggression through genetics, neural, and biochemical influences, and our psychology influences aggression through the frustration-aggression principle, which is the principle that frustration creates anger, which in turn generates aggression. Our social cultural factors influencing aggression could be basically summed up into de-individuation or toxic parental figures. And then moving on to attraction, a little lighter topic, is the force that draws together friends and romantic partners. The mere exposure effect is the phenomenon that repeated exposure to new stimuli increases the liking of them. So the more you see someone, the more you're likely to begin liking them. The aspect of a person that unfortunately impacts our first impressions of them the most is their physical appearance. And the difference between passionate love and companionate love is passionate is an aroused state of intense positive absorption of another, usually present at the beginning. And companionate love is the deep affectionate attachment we feel for those with whom our lives are intertwined, and usually takes place once we have a solid relationship. Our last topic is altruism, conflict, and peacemaking. Altruism is defined as our selfless regard for the welfare of others. However, psychologists have found that we're instinctively more likely to help others when A, they appear to need and deserve help, B, they're in some way similar to us, or C, they're a woman. But more influential phenomenon have to do with being a bystander. In fact, the bystander effect is the tendency for any given bystander to actually be less likely to give aid if other bystanders are also present. If we're the only person around when someone needs help, we assume responsibility. But if others are there too, we almost always decide that they can deal with it, and we do nothing. We all want to be helped though, and a couple of terms regarding this are social exchange theory, reciprocity norm, and social responsibility norm. Conflicts form when we don't empathize and we're close-minded. An example of this is mirror image perceptions, which are mutual views often held by conflicting people, as when each side sees itself as ethical and peaceful and correct, and views the other side as evil and aggressive. However, on the opposite side, we're able to keep peace because our shared goals as a human race persist. Our superordinate goals are our shared goals that override differences among people and require their cooperation. Be like Thor, just enjoy peace. And that is it, guys. We've finally finished our entire review system for this AP exam. And if you remember all of these concepts and keep these terms in mind, you'll be sure to get a 5. Thanks for listening, and make sure to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.